Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen. We might get underway for this session, which is Current Controversies and Future Directions in Situational Crime Prevention. My name is Richard Wortley from the Jules Dando Institute. So we've got three talks today, the first by Kate Bowers and Shane Johnson. The second by myself, I have to chair my own presentation, and the third by Faisal Umar. We might get underway. I think what we've agreed to do is that the speakers can take up to 30 minutes, but they can choose whether to have some questions directly after their talk. So if they want to end before that 30 minutes, we'll take some questions directly then. And then if we have some time at the end, we'll do a wrap-up with where questions can be directed at all three presentations. So Shane, you're first. Thanks.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. So Kate and I are going to do a bit of a double act, and we're going to speak to the title that you see in front of you, Does Situational Crime Prevention Simply Displace Crime? Kate answered that this morning in this session, so I'm going to sit down now and take questions. What we'll do in the talk is we'll start off with a little bit of theory as to why we may or may not expect this to take place. We're then going to review a little bit about what we know about the impact of situational crime prevention interventions on crime. What impact do they have? Then we'll discuss previous research which has looked at the extent to which situational measures do or don't displace crime. And then we'll discuss the results of a recent meta-analysis that we've done on this particular topic. Okay, so the background to this, as you heard Marcus and Ron talk about this morning, is the idea that from a situational perspective, the reason that crime occurs is the result of a person's situation interaction. So crime results because of a motivated offender encountering a suitable opportunity in the absence of a capable guardian. So the guiding principle of situational crime prevention is to remove those opportunities for crime so as to reduce crime events occurring. Criminologists that take a more dispositional perspective on the causes of crime would argue that this doesn't actually tackle the root causes of crime, because offenders still have their motivations unchanged as a consequence of the situational crime prevention intervention. And as Marcus and Ron again said this morning, we'd probably argue that actually opportunity is one of the root causes of crime. But nevertheless, the dispositional perspective would say that it doesn't address the motivation of offenders, and therefore a natural consequence of situational crime prevention would be the displacement of criminal activity. So 6 different types of displacement have been discussed in the literature. The first of those is spatial displacement, where crime is prevented in one location and it simply moves to another. Second is temporal displacement, where let's say we prevent crime from occurring in the day, only to find it taking place more frequently at night. We may have target displacement. So, for example, we might prevent crimes against young people or students, only to find that offenders switch targets and target the elderly, for example. We may have a fence switch, so we prevent offenders from committing crimes like burglary, but they switch to shoplifting or vehicle crime. Tactical switch, so they stop breaking in to houses via the rear of the property and move to breaking in at the front. Then the 6th kind, which was came to light relatively late in the day, was an idea from Ken Pease of offender replacement. So the idea here is that if we arrest offenders, but we don't actually address the underlying criminal opportunity structure, other offenders will simply take their place and take advantage of those opportunities that remain. Now, the 6 types of displacement that are possible, spatial displacement is by far the most commonly thought of and discussed, and the one which is most commonly researched, and it's the one that we'll focus on most today, although Kate will talk about the other forms a little. Now, the problem is that if displacement does take place, and in the extreme case, it would actually undermine any reductions realized through situational crime prevention. There would be no net effect of situational measures, so it's important that we address this issue empirically. So going from that rather pessimistic perspective, if we actually look to the literature, it's much more optimistic. In fact, we find in those studies where crime displacement has been noticed, rarely is it total. So what we'll find is, let's say we reduce 100 crimes at one location, we may find that some crime is displaced, but perhaps it's only 30 crimes rather than the total 100. In other studies, we find that there's actually no change as a concept. So a situational measure may reduce crime in a target area, and in the areas nearby, we see no change in crime rates. Now, at the other end of the extreme, sometimes we see what Ron Clark and David Weisberg refer to as a diffusion of crime control benefits, and that Kate talked about today. So we see a reduction in the treatment area, but also in the adjacent areas. There are at least two mechanisms for thinking that we might actually see a diffusion of crime control benefit. The first of those is a deterrent effect. So thinking about why offenders, or the event-level decisions that offenders engage in, according to the rational choice perspective, offenders weigh up the risk involved in committing an offence, the effort involved, and the rewards that they perceive that they'll get from committing a particular offence. If we increase the perceived risk to committing a crime, and it exceeds the perceived rewards, the idea is that that will deter them from committing offences. Police patrols might increase an offender's perceived risk, but so too might situational interventions like CCTV. Now, rarely do offenders know the geographical extent of an intervention. So it's likely that in some occasions they'll believe that the extent or the geographical coverage of an intervention extends further than it in fact does, which can lead to a diffusion of benefit. A second mechanism is discouragement. So in this case, we increase the effort involved in committing an offence. So for instance, in households, we make it more difficult for offenders to break into homes. And that can increase to a level or a perceived level that offenders believe that this exceeds the expected rewards. Again, offenders won't know necessarily the geographical extent of an intervention, and therefore this discouragement extends beyond the area of intervention. Now, another point to make when considering displacement was actually made by Ron this morning, which, is that not all offenders are equal. So while some offenders will be highly motivated, and when we reduce opportunities at one location, they'll seek out others, but many offenders are simply opportunistic in nature and won't seek out other possibilities. This is something that people forget when they think about this hydraulic kind of approach of crime being likely to be displaced. Okay, so I'm going to now turn to what we know about situational crime prevention and what the effects of situational measures are on crime. Now, this comes from a book chapter that Kate and I wrote for David Farrington and David Weisberg, where we looked at the five systematic reviews that have been published, which have examined the effect of situational measures on crime. Across those 5 systematic reviews that we found, there were 76 different studies, which evaluated a total of 115 situational crime prevention interventions. So just to give you a sense, first of all, of the trends in those evaluations, we have a timeline here. So over time, what we see is, if you look at the thick black line, we see an increase in the number of primary evaluations. That tails off at the end of the period. That's simply because the systematic reviews took place when you see the vertical line. So it's just an artifact of our data collection. You can also see on this particular graph the types of interventions that have been evaluated. So we can see that, for instance, CCTV evaluations tended to be conducted much later in time than did, for instance, Neighbourhood Watch. So we've got quite a bit of data on situational interventions. But what do those evaluations tell us about situational crime prevention? So what I'm going to do now is just show you the estimates of effect size that were calculated across those 115 evaluations for which we have data. So we calculated here an odds ratio for each of the evaluations, and I won't go into any detail, but the odds ratio essentially summarizes the extent to which crime reduced in a treatment area relative to a control area. And if we find that the odds ratio on the graph on the left falls on this side, it indicates crime declined more quickly in the treatment area than in a comparison area. If it's on the left-hand side, it means that crime went up in the treatment area compared to the control. So if we order these effect sizes in terms of when they were conducted, this is the pattern that we see. It's quite difficult to actually interpret that to some extent. There are a lot of dots on the graph. So the dots indicate the point estimate of effect. The horizontal lines are the confidence intervals within which the true effect size lies. What you may not be able to see is that most of those dots tend to lie on the right-hand side of that graph, indicating a favorable treatment effect. On the right-hand side, what we've done is to synthesize these results using meta-analysis. So we compute a weighted mean effect size so that we can, for instance, work out what was the weighted mean effect of intervention by 1980, by 1985, and so on. Could do with a drum roll at this point, I guess. What do we find? So two things you see is those dots are to the right of the line. You see the confidence intervals narrow, so we can be more certain about the impact of intervention. Overall, across all of the interventions that were evaluated, we see that roughly there's around about a 20% decrease in crime in the treatment areas relative to the control areas. And that's a statistically reliable impact. So that's a 20% reduction across these different interventions. Now, there's a number of things to bear in mind when looking at that. That's 20% across all of the different interventions, which varied. So some were CCTV, some were street lighting, and so on. They varied in terms of where they were implemented, so the context would have differed. They vary in terms of intensity, so some of these would have had more investment than others, and we know from evaluations that more investment generally leads to a greater return. But the underlying point is that we see that across these studies, we get a reliable impact of situational crime prevention. This morning, one of the questions that came up was, how do these compare to interventions which target offenders? Well, I think to bear in mind is that these studies focus on how much crime is reduced in a particular area, whereas offender-based interventions don't look at crime in an area level. They just look at reoffending rates. So it's very difficult to compare these. Okay, so this is a positive result of the meta-analysis. But do these interventions lead to displacement? Well, if we look to the literature, there have been a few literature reviews conducted. Some of those are listed on the first point. Now, a weakness with those particular studies is that they're done on an ad hoc basis, so it's possible that we exclude some important studies. They've also typically used vote counting techniques when coming to conclusions in these studies. So they'll count up how many studies show a favorable effect, how many show displacement, how many show diffusion of benefit, and so on, but don't use statistical meta-analysis. As to situational crime prevention, Rob Jarrett and Kate Bowers published a study in Criminology in 2009. Identified all the studies which were suitable for this analysis, but didn't conduct a traditional meta-analysis. So recently, with Rob, Kate and I have conducted an updated review, which Kate's going to talk to in 1 second. But before saying that, we also published a systematic review of geographically focused policing initiatives, which we published in 2011, which did use a systematic review and meta-analytic techniques. And what we found from that was that when policing interventions reduce crime in a target area, they're just as likely, if not more likely, to diffuse benefits than they are to displace crime. At that point, I'm going to hand over to Kate.
Okay, so Shane's nicely set up the piece of research that we wanted to do, which was, although Garrett and Bowers had a look at the overall levels of displacement, diffusion and benefit, we wanted to update this, and we also wanted to conduct a meta-analytical study which was restricted to situational crime prevention measures alone. So what we did was, fortunately, because the Garrett and Bowers paper had found a lot of the situational crime prevention evaluation literature, we were able to just update that, and we found a further 27 new reviews on top of the original sample that we could have a look at. Then, in terms of working out ones we could actually use in the statistical quantification of effect size, the inclusion criteria are laid out here. So we had to make sure that the evaluation comprised of a dominant or exclusive situational intervention, because otherwise we weren't really just going to be talking about situational preventions. And it also needed to use it had to have a research method which had a quantitative outcome measure of crime. And the complicated thing about displacement studies is you need to measure before and after counts of crime for not 2 but 3 areas. So you need to count them first of all for the target area itself where the treatment's gone in. You need to know the amount of crime before and after intervention. You need to have a suitable control area where you can have a look at those differences before and after. And finally, you need to have information on, because we were looking at spatial displacement here, what you call a geographical displacement buffer zone. zone. They're called a range of different things, catchment areas or displacement zones, but the idea is you need to have a third area, which is a place that you might expect offender activity to go to as a result of the measures that are undertaken in the treatment area, and you need to have a pre and post count for that as well. So that's the minimum that we needed. There are only 13 studies that had that information that we needed, most of them being a quasi-experimental design, and I was hearing from Cody in the last session that it does seem to be the case that situational crime prevention maybe does have a focus on these kind of designs rather than RCTs. The majority of the ones we used also had just one control area, which they used for both the treatment area itself and also the expected area for displacement. There have been a couple of other pieces of work which actually have used a separate control area for where the displacement might go in. You could argue that that improves the internal validity of the experiment. And so in some cases that's been the chosen method. There is a range in terms of the follow-up periods. They go from 6 months to 36 months with a mean of 14. And so some were tracking for longer than others. And also they were equally split concerning whether or not they just looked at one crime type or they looked at a range of different crime types. As Shane said before, we were using odds ratio calculations in this particular piece of work as well. And we used a random effects model because there's quite a lot of heterogeneity across the different effect sizes. So these are more robust methods in those particular situations. One thing when you have these studies that we quite often see is that many of the studies have more than one observation for the same treatment area. So what you'll have had is the evaluation team will have looked at the effect of the intervention in the treatment area. They might have looked at multiple different crimes types for the particular treatment area. They might have looked at different possible control areas. They might have looked at a range of different buffer areas. Now, the problem from a statistical point of view with all that is it means that we're going to have dependency. If we put all those different possibilities into one overall measure of effect size, we're defeating one of the assumptions, which is that all the areas are independent of each other. So we use two methods to try and get around this problem, which I'll outline as we go on. Just briefly, one reports the best and worst case scenario. So for each of those treatment areas, you find the worst situation in terms of how effective it was, and you find the best one, and you contrast those two things to look at both ends of the spectrum. The problem with that kind of analysis is it's looking at extremes by definition. So we have another method for looking at the possibilities in between, which I'll explain to you in a minute. So I don't know how fantastically well you can see that, but what we can see here is the best and worst case scenarios. And in each of these cases, you'll see that there's two effect sizes for each of the studies involved. So you can see that there's two lines. There's one it doesn't come out very well on this slide, I'm afraid. But for the Weisberg and Green study, for example, at the top, you can see there's two lines. The one at the top, which is kind of blacker, is for the treatment area, and the one just underneath that is for the catchment or the displacement or diffusion area for that particular study. Okay, and as Shane said before, if you just imagine that the way of interpreting these easily is anything to the right-hand side favours treatment, but also from the perspective of displacement and diffusion of benefit, anything to the right-hand side, if it's a catchment area, looking at diffusion or displacement, favours the idea of it being a diffusion of benefit. Yeah? And anything to the left-hand side of the line either shows a negative effect of treatment, or it shows some sort of possible effect of displacement. Now, encouragingly, you can see that, as Shane showed before, first of all, a lot of the treatment areas are showing a significant effect or a positive effect of treatment in terms of it reducing compared to a suitable control. In fact, you can see this overall effect size just here at the bottom. I don't know if I'm going to be able to quite reach it with my finger, but there shows that the overall effect size is showing that there's a positive overall effect of treatment. Now, the dot underneath it is for the displacement and diffusion area. Now, whilst this wasn't significant, it was favouring just slightly diffusion of benefit. So it was a non-significant reduction in the buffer areas compared to a control area for the best case scenario. You get a small reversal of that. For the worst case scenario, you still get the overall treatment effect, but you get just a slight indication of perhaps on balance displacement happening, but again, it's not a statistically significant effect. This looks like a barcode, I know, but it's a kind of neat new method that we've been playing with, which was this idea of not looking just at the extremes, but looking at the possibilities in the middle. We worked out that if you had to look at all the combinations and permutations of the different treatment effects you could possibly put in, there was something like 8,000 of them overall, I think. Yeah, so we didn't want to do all of those. So we chose a random 100 of those combinations of permutations, and then came up with an individual overall mean effect size for each of those. And then what we've done here is we've just come up with an overall mean effect of all those mean effect sizes, if you like. And so you can see here on the left-hand side again, showing the same story, that there's an overall positive effect of treatment in terms of the situational crime prevention measures. And again, just as we saw on the last slide, there is no significant effect in the catchment areas in terms of diffusion or displacement. Okay, one thing you can argue is displacement should only happen where there's a treatment effect. And this is one of the things people have said to us before. Okay, so what's the point in looking at displacement if the treatment effect didn't even work? So we've actually also made sure that this isn't just some statistical artifact. So we've selected those where we've got a definite positive effect of treatment and recalculated. And even in that case, we find no evidence of significant displacement or significant diffusion of benefit. So the fact of the matter is that's fairly encouraging, I would say. I would say, okay, it really shows that displacement as a result of situational crime prevention just doesn't necessarily happen, and it doesn't happen to any statistical level that we need to start worrying about as practitioners. And there's variation, and in some cases displacement happens, but in other cases diffusion of benefit happens too. Just a couple of quick recommendations, really. The Braga et al. Review was looking at hotspot policing as a set of studies on its own and measures displacement. One thing we should be doing from a situational point of view is producing these kind of plots for each of the individual types of situational crime prevention. So far they've been put together, but it would be kind of useful for us to know whether or not, for instance, diffusion was more likely with CCTV-based ones, those kind of analysis. That is actually quite difficult to do because you have to have a lot of effect sizes to do that. The other thing that we need to think about really is whether or not we should think about the scale of displacement. And so Telep et al. Have just been looking at this possibility by reviewing large displacement in large-scale geographical areas. There could be some reasons why you wouldn't expect this as much. For example, if it's a large area, surely because there's going to be longer distances involved, you might be less likely to actually make the effort to go all that way and to undertake criminal activity. But there's also this argument that there's differences in enforcement across administrative boundaries. So they might put a policy in administrative boundary A, and it might be easier to do that in boundary B. So maybe we do need to be looking at large-scale displacement for that reason. Their meta-analysis came up with a very similar result to the ones that we've done more at the micro level. Again, you get a positive effect of intervention, and there's no significant diffusional displacement. So it seems to be the case that there's no evidence of displacement There's no significant diffusion of benefit either. Generally, there seems to be a small effect where the mean effect size favours diffusion of benefit, and that's not always the case, but we see that evidence in some places. And I just finish in saying that this gives evidence towards the idea that there's this very strong type coupling between crime and place. So basically, situational measures sit very well with this idea, and the fact is that when you decouple the crime from the place, it doesn't recouple very easily elsewhere. There's a very strong relationship between those two things, and that's good for us because it means when we prevent crime in this particular place, we don't have to worry about it floating off and necessarily causing a problem elsewhere. A couple of extra things that we want to do is search for temporal displacement more accurately. As Shane said earlier, it seems to be that we look at spatial displacement because it's easier methodologically, but we should be looking more to see whether or not things displace in time as well as in place. And also we think perhaps more informed studies of displacement or diffusion. So for instance, the idea of directionality, I haven't seen consistent work at looking at that. Instead of saying, oh, it's going to go somewhere to this buffer area, saying, well, it's likely if it does go from anywhere to anywhere else to be between these two estates because this estate is quite similar in nature to this estate. Equally, you might think about the most likely targets. So, for instance, the idea is that you might target hard than one petrol forecourt in a particular way. What consequence does doing it there have to all the other petrol forecourts of the same brand nearby? And that could be a possible diffusion of benefit you're looking for, because they might think, well, if it's been done in this area, it's going to be been done likewise in nearby areas. So we think that perhaps we need to make sure that because, after all, situational crime prevention is specific, so the search for displacement and diffusion of benefit should be. Thank you. We've used up all our time. Oh, careful.
You tore my ear off.
Just go straight on.
Oh. Well, if there's a burning question while I try to figure out how to get my talk up, has anyone got one? Sorry, just... Are you giving me instructions, Marcus? Slideshow.
Thanks. Sorry. Is it on? Oh, sorry. Hi. Okay, thanks. Can I just clarify? Because previously you found partial displacement in some studies. Did I hear you right? Did you say there's no displacement?
Are you saying that there's no displacement? It means that overall, as a mean effect size, so if you actually have a look at all the additive effects together, then there's no overall evidence of it. So you're looking at what an average might be, if you like. But at the individual level, you find variation, and that's kind of interesting in itself. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll ask you again later.
Okay, yeah, hopefully we can crib some time and have some more questions at the end so you can perhaps save those up. So I'll get on with mine. So this title is slightly different to the one that appears in the program, but still essentially get the idea that it's going to be a critique of rational choice theory. And after I sent this abstract in, it gradually dawned on me that providing a critique of rational choice theory might not be the most sensitive thing to do at a symposium that is here to honour Ron Clark and his work in situational crime prevention. And my consternation has been increased slightly by seeing not only Ron Clark in the audience, but Derek Cornish at the back again. So I'm a little bit more nervous than I would normally be. All I can say is that this is a critique that's kind of offered in love, if you like. Unlike many critics of rational choice and situational crime prevention, we come not to weaken it, but to strengthen it, hopefully. And we see this as kind of a natural progression of theory. Rational choice, after all, has been around for 30 years. And I'd also say that if there are any mean bits, Nick Tilley put them in. So, what's our argument? Well, as I said, we think rational choice perspectives have served situational crime prevention well. But we think it's time, as with any theoretical approach, to assess its utility. to have a look at it. In some ways, we think that situational crime prevention has suffered from its association with rational choice perspective. If you look at the critiques of situational crime prevention in the literature from outside of the field, they're almost always critiques of rational choice theory. And the logic is something like this. Situational crime prevention depends on rational choice theory. Offenders aren't rational, or we can find examples when offenders aren't rational. Therefore, surely situational crime prevention is a flawed approach. And I think that's been an unfortunate theme that's developed in much of the literature. There's been, before, theoretical criticisms of rational choice perspective from both outside of the field, but also some from within. So we want to reprise some of those here, but we also want to talk, I think, perhaps for the first time, about some of the practical problems with rational choice in terms of how it does inform situational crime prevention. We want to propose to you 10 tenets that we hope are widely accepted that describe what the person's situation might look like, and to provide kind of a broad framework for the person-situation interaction. And just to repeat what I said at the beginning, just to misquote Mark Anthony, we come to praise situational crime prevention, not to bury it. So first, a little bit of history. The first time, now I have Ron in the audience so he can correct me if I'm wrong, but the first time I could find that a situational view was put forward by Ron was in a 1967 paper on absconding from Borstals or from approved schools. And it's interesting to note this paper came out 4 years before the seminal papers of Jeffrey and 5 years before the one of Newman. So it really does make Ron a true pioneer of this area. So that paper, by the way, was about looking for reasons why young people escape from approved schools, and Ron found that most of the reasons were to do with situational factors like the weather, the time of day, the way the administration was run. He could find no consistent personality factors that accounted for that. At that point, though, there was no theory attached to these observations. They were reported as empirical kind of findings. Jeffrey came along in 1971 with Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, and his book is rich with theory, and it's essentially unreconstructed behaviourism, really. He was a behaviourist, a Skinnerian, and he saw things pretty much in those kind of operant conditioning terms. Next along was Newman, and interestingly, with Newman, he didn't talk about offenders at all. His book on defensible space is all about changing the behaviour of residents. And the residents would somehow defend their properties more effectively. And implied in that was that offenders would be deterred, but there was absolutely no discussion by what mechanisms offenders would be deterred. So the idea of defensible space and territoriality is a phenomenon that's possessed by territorial owners, not territorial invaders. Back to Ron and Pat as well here. So the idea of crime as opportunity in 1973, still no mention of rational choice theory, but situational inducements to commit crime. I find the word inducements actually very interesting here. 1980, Ron talks about a choice model, but again doesn't attach rational to it. And then in 1985, we get the classic exposition of rational choice perspective by Ron and Derek. A very long paper. I've discovered that most people have read the condensed version that appears in a year later in the Rational Choice book. And if you haven't read the original 1985 paper, you should go back and read it. It's a very detailed paper. And one of the things that's interesting about it for the arguments I'm going to raise here is the sweeping kind of review it does of the literature at that time that supported the situational view of offending. Anyway, the main point I want to make in going through this history is that we can see that rational choice theory didn't produce situational crime prevention, in my view, and again I can be corrected by the people who wrote those papers. But the idea of situational crime prevention existed at least 15 years before, and you could argue, in fact, that situational crime prevention, not labelled in that way, has existed from antiquity when people defended themselves against invasion and so forth. But my reading, or our reading of this, is that rational choice theory came along, or rational choice perspective came along at a later date to put a theoretical substance under a position that was already fairly well developed at that point. So, I said, I think there are some well-rehearsed theoretical shortcomings of rational choice theory as a perspective of crime, or a description of crime. Point to be made here, and again that gets lost by so many of the critics, is that nothing I'm going to say here should be a surprise to Ron and Derek, because they talked about it in 1985. Nowhere in that paper, that 1985 paper, they make it abundantly clear that they're not presenting a detailed description of how offenders think. They're presenting a good enough theory for practice. There are qualifications right throughout that paper. They talk about bounded rationality. They talk about the three main shortcomings I'm going to list here. So the fact that we now know, and we knew then, that rationality is constrained by all sorts of cognitive errors and heuristics and biases, that there are very few theorists, or in fact no theorists, actually within the rational choice perspective and other disciplines who would say that offenders are purely rational. We know that emotion can affect the quality of decisions that are made, that someone who's highly emotional pays less attention to the outcomes of behaviour than someone who's not so aroused, and that a lot of behaviour, in fact, doesn't involve controlled thinking, conscious thinking. A lot of it is subconscious, automatic, and occurs as habits and schema, event schema, and so forth. The point, just to go back to it, the point is that all of those points are actually mentioned in the 1985 paper. The problem for me is that they were mentioned and dismissed. So what happened in that 1985 paper is that Ron and Derek say that we understand that rationality is bounded, but let's focus on the rationality part. And I think what's happened since then is that no one's actually examined those bounded parts, or at least no one's done it within criminology. But they've done it within economics and they've done it within psychology, and that literature's left us behind. So as I look at our field, the situational crime prevention field, it's as if we're frozen in 1985 when a whole lot of developments in the cognitive science have occurred in those other disciplines. So somehow we've kind of been cut adrift from those. So as I say here, I think what these other disciplines have shown us is that the way people deviate from rationality can be as interesting and as important as the way that they conform. And I think simply the label of bounded rationality has somehow given us comfort to think that we can just forget about those bounded elements. Anyway, those criticisms have been made both from within rational choice, or within the situational kind of field, and outside of it. I want to talk, though, we've always comforted ourselves by saying, though, that nevertheless, rational choice perspective has provided us with a very useful model for practitioners. And actually, I agree, I think it has, true. That's true. But increasingly, I think there are signs that even in the field of practice, rational choice might be holding situational crime prevention back as the only model that underpins it. So we all know the 25 techniques. If we look at the relationship between rational choice perspective and those 25 techniques, I think there's some groaning and some stretching and some creaking that's going on there. So some techniques explained by rational choice perspective can be explained by alternative theories, for a start. For example, social learning theory can explain many of the same kind of associations that rational choice would explain. I think increasingly, particularly since the fourth and fifth columns were introduced into the 25 techniques, there are interventions or strategies that aren't explained by rational choice theory. Now, at a stretch, you could say removing excuses is kind of rational choice, I suppose. Self-condemnation is a kind of cost. But I think that's a bit of a stretch. I don't think by any stretch you can say reducing provocations has anything to do with rational choice. And so we have that kind of break. I think there are some techniques not explained by rational choice and not covered in the table. So I've already talked about the role of automatic thinking, about routine behaviours. There's nothing really there about disrupting or priming those behaviours, for example. And finally, I think there are some techniques that actually don't involve any rationality at all. So actually, removing opportunity is not about people adjusting their cost-benefit analysis. It's actually taking away the entire process of making a rational choice. If you have an offender who wants to steal laptops and a driver has taken the laptop out of the car and it doesn't appear, there's no rational choice involved in not stealing a laptop in that case. It simply doesn't enter the situation. So particularly things like removing opportunity aren't about changing decisions, they're about removing the need for a decision. So, as I said, there's a whole range of alternative models, many of which are indeed covered in the 1985 paper, both from psychology, sociology. There are also models from economics and so forth. So, social psychology talks about the variations of behaviour as they move from social setting to social setting, the role of conformity, the role of authority figures and that kind of thing. Behaviourism, as I've already mentioned, was highlighted by Jeffrey as a model that can describe change. The way Jeffrey put it is that behaviour is determined by its consequences. He didn't make any kind of assumptions about how those consequences were judged, simply that the consequences guided behaviour. So he kind of saw it in that light. I've already said cognitive psychology. More and more, there's a whole range of books coming out just in the last year or so looking at the intersection between emotion and cognition. Again, none of which has really entered into our field, but sits in cognitive psychology. Environmental psychology, evolutionary psychology becoming a topic of great interest, how people behave in the here and now based on echoes of strategies that, were in our forebears 100,000 years ago. And from sociology, symbolic interactionism, exchange theory, analytic psychology. We could also talk about delinquency and drift and those kinds of ideas. So as we were been thinking about this, in fact, Nick and I have been sitting on a paper for the last 3 years. We're trying to write that put some of these ideas together. Our early thought was we'd come up with some kind of mega theory or integrative theory or glue some theories together in some way that covered all of these points, and we abandoned that as a bad idea. And so what I want to present is not some kind of new integrated theory that challenges or augments the rational choice perspective, but really to try to come to some agreed upon tenets or principles that describe the person-situation interaction, that provide kind of a framework or a boundary about the way we think that human beings operate within contexts. And as I said, this is not to try to put these theories together, but to give this broad perspective. Our view is that no matter what theory we were to select or to come up with, there'd be someone criticising that as well, and rightly so, because theories by their nature tend to have, they cover a certain bound. So let's get onto those 10 tenets and see if they are indeed things that we can all agree on. Well, here's the first 5. And I think they go through in a fairly logical order. The first is the potential to commit crime is widely distributed in the population. By the way, these tenets, by the fact that they're, we hope, widely agreed to, I hope none of them come as any great surprise. We're not putting them out as if they're something that that we've uniquely thought of. So, again, this is, I think, widely accepted in our area, that crime, the idea of dividing the world into offenders and non-offenders is nonsense, that almost everybody has the potential to commit crime, almost everybody does commit crime at some point in their life, and that there's a basic latent potential in all human beings. If we're going to look at evolutionary psychology, we would say that it was universal because of our kind of evolutionary construction, for example. This basic capacity to commit crime. human repertoire for behaviour is very, very broad, and we could all do it. Second tenet is that, nevertheless, that potential varies within the population. There are some people in the population who are highly predisposed to commit crime. There are some who are weakly predisposed to commit crime. Indeed, most of us are probably weakly predisposed to commit crime, if you think about the 80-20 rule. From a situational point of view, we don't know why this is. It's probably a combination of perhaps biological upbringing, biological background, a person's upbringing, the social world in which they're enmeshed. These are really issues outside of a situation analysis, but at some level they probably account for the fact that we vary in this potential. The third tenet is that that potential too varies within the same individual over time. The classic demonstration of this is the age crime curve. We know that people are most likely to commit crime in their adolescence, and it gradually kind of, well, in fact quite steeply diminishes. But we could probably go into more micro levels of time. We could think about how someone's potential might vary over a year or over a week or even over a day. In other words, people aren't always there ready to commit crime 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all of their life. The fourth tenet then is that people will enter situations with varying states of readiness to commit crime. Again, this is captured in a lot of the situational literature already, but some people enter situations highly motivated to commit crime with preformed intentions and plans. Others simply come in with a basic readiness to accept opportunities, and others come in with no particular thought of committing crime but might be provoked or otherwise induced in committing crime. Just an aside, this doesn't necessarily correlate with a person's more stable potential. So, for example, you could have someone who has a high predisposition for crime who enters a situation without any particular intention to commit crime and is tempted or induced to commit crime at that point. So we're talking about something that's more of a kind of immediate state rather than a more stable kind of potential. Fifth, the likelihood that a given individual will engage in crime varies across situations. And again, fairly standard for a situational perspective. All of us vary across situations in the way we behave, the way we feel, and the way we act. Even the most honest person is not always honest. Even the most confident person is not always confident. How we act depends upon where we are, and there's variation across situations for each of us. The example I always give for this, it's becoming less and less relevant, is Michael Jackson. So often with a class I'll say, put your hand up if you think Michael Jackson was an extrovert. About half the class put their hand up. Other half, then I say, put your hand up if you think Michael Jackson was an introvert, and about half the class put their hand up. And of course the reason is they're both right, and it depends on where you see Michael Jackson, on stage or being interviewed. Number 6, the likelihood that a given situation will activate a criminal response varies across individuals. Now, what does that mean? We keep talking about a person-situation interaction. Rarely do we unpack what a person-situation interaction means. And actually, a person-situation interaction can mean two things. The usual way we think about it is some kind of a person interacts with a situation, and so they respond to a situation, and there's that kind of interaction. Two people talking are interacting with one another. But actually, certainly in psychology, when they talk about a person-situation interaction, they don't talk about that at all. They talk about the fact that situations affect individuals differently. That two people can enter the same situation and react differently to it. That their behaviour is contingent upon the situation. And there's an interaction between who they are and the environment they're in. And classically, in those sort of situations, or in that context, situations and the characteristics of the individual are multiplicative rather than additive, which simply means that you're much, much more likely to get crime when you have a high criminogenic situation and a highly predisposed individual who's going to commit crime. Those two things together cause the perfect storm, rather than each rather than there being an additive kind of effect there's a multiplicative effect. So that's the way a person situation actually is often understood in this context. Number 7, situations affect an individual in multiple ways across moral, cognitive, affective and behavioural domains. And this is simply to say that I think one of the problems with rational choice perspective is it's limited to the cognitive domain. But we can see the effects occur in other areas as well. We know it affects people's emotions, for example. We know it affects the way they reason in a moral sense. And sometimes it can cause reflexive behavioural responses as well. So we think one of the restrictions, the fundamental restrictions of rational choice is to propose this interaction purely in cognitive terms. Number 8, the relationship between an individual and a situation is bidirectional and iterative. This goes back to my other point. So this is the usual way we think about a person-situation interaction. That there's this kind of relationship from the offender back to the situation. Here again, I've got to say, I've never really thought that the rational choice perspective captured that bidirectionality very effectively. If you think about the rational choice perspective, what it actually proposes is an offender who's in control of the situation, in fact. They're scanning the environment, scanning the situation, and they're choosing how to respond to it. They're picking out the bits, they're processing that, and they're responding on their own terms. There's no real sense for me in the rational choice perspective of the individual being fundamentally affected by their environment. We see this in other models. We see it in the work of Zimbardo, for example, where it's not this kind of rational process where the offender can choose how they're affected. The environment fundamentally changes the nature of the individual. It changes their moral outlook, for example. It changes their behaviour. It changes who they are. And so one of the things I personally would like to see in a broadened view of the person-situation interaction as we propose it is a better sense of this bidirectionality. This bidirectionality, although I think is well captured in our field with this concept of scripts, because we get this iterative approach, don't we, where the environment affects me, I affect the environment, and so we can see the crime unfolding as a series of iterative person-situation interactions. Number 9, and again a deviation I think from rational choice perspective, is that individuals are only partially aware of the ways that situations affect their behaviour. A lot of effects of the environment aren't particularly well understood by an individual receiving it. We can behave in ways that we don't really understand. We can certainly behave in ways that we don't think about, that become routine, that become habits, that become reflective. And I'd like to see some recognition of those kinds of behaviours. Now, again, we talk about this in our field. We talk about burglars who get into houses and then act in a routinized way. And back in 1985, Ron and Derek talked about standing decisions. So these things are recognised, but they've been put to the side. They've not really been taken any further. And finally, that situations constrain what particular crimes an individual can commit in terms of the availability of crime opportunities and the resources she can draw on to commit crime. And this simply says that not all situations can be criminogenic. As I said, if there are no crime opportunities there, then the whole idea of decision-making or any kind of interaction is irrelevant. And sometimes an offender may want to commit crime but not have the resources to do it, so the whole thing becomes irrelevant again. So that's the 10 tenets, and as I said, our thought is not to try to convert that into some kind of macro theory, but to have that there as some kind of statement or expression about the breadth of and the way that individuals and their environment interact and produce crime. And the way I see it, we're still kind of developing this idea, is that a whole range of theories can be plugged in underneath that to describe different kinds of interactions, different sorts of effects. So I'm not arguing for a theoryless model, quite the reverse. I'm simply saying, I'm also not arguing, by the way, that rational choice ought to be abandoned. What I'm saying is it's one of a whole range of competing models. And I think we need some framework to bring in some of these other perspectives as well. So, in conclusion, rational choice is just one way to portray the person-situation interaction. And actually, again, if you read the 1985 paper, it's kind of like a surprise to me at the end that's the winner, in a sense. There's a whole range of interesting theoretical perspectives, and the winner is rational choice. I think any one theory, be it rational choice or social learning or whatever it is going to be inadequate. I've got 8 axioms. I should say we've altered the axioms from 8 to 10. Then Nick said you couldn't possibly have 8 because 10 is a much better number. So I added 2 last night. And I hope that the 10 axioms provide a basis for a more inclusive and a less divisive underpinning of situational crime prevention. And one, by the way, that brings situational crime prevention closer to some of the original disciplines from which it draws its ideas, from psychology and economics and so forth, and sociology. I think one of the problems has been that we've gone off and done our own thing for 30 years and things have moved on elsewhere. Okay, thanks. And again, I've got maybe 4 minutes if we want to ask questions. Well, I'll ask Faisal to maybe set himself up.
Ron's got one.
Ron, why did I think it would be you?
The reason I've leapt up is not because I'm angry, but I've just got to go in a minute or two. I think it's a very interesting paper, and it's given me quite a lot to think about. I'm not sure I'm completely sold on your argument. You wouldn't expect me to be. But just a couple of small points, and then I'll leave it to the rest of you to fight it out, because I've got to go. One of the things that Derek and I were really keen on was simplicity. Because we're trying to communicate, not just to criminologists, we're trying to communicate to, like the minister today. And when you get a very complex set of arguments and points, you kind of lose people. Not that you have, but I'm talking about communicating with a broad range of people who you're trying to influence. So some of our thinking was due to simplicity. Another thing was that we were very taken with the idea that you have to get inside offenders' minds to understand how they see the problem, which was missing from a lot of the theories that you've mentioned there, or many of them anyway. So we were very interested in trying to understand and see it from the offender's point of view. The third thing I would say, which I think was important, and obviously this is just a first take, okay? The other thing that I was, and I think Derek would share this, was that we were very interested in the idea of crime benefiting individuals. And that's a simple idea to explain. You know, people commit crimes because they're seeking to benefit themselves. Now that's an easy thing to explain. Policymakers might or might not agree with it, but they can understand what the point is. So without getting into the detail of what you're talking about, I was just trying to give some of the framework of what we were thinking about to begin with. Okay?
Yeah, actually I would agree with the need for simple messages, and I think the rational choice perspective has been extremely effective that way, and I've always kind of said that. I think there are two audiences, though. I think there are the practitioners, and you need to package it. And again, you've been par excellence in coming up with, very simple slogans. And I use that word as a compliment. Crime follows opportunity, for example. Really simple stuff. But there are two audiences, and one of the audiences are academics. And I think it's their job to kind of enrich this area. And I think the bounded kind of argument has inhibited that. I hear people at ECHA, for example, who think that rational choice perspective is a model of an up-to-date description, theoretical description of how people think, offenders think, and I don't think they should be thinking that if they're researchers. I think that's okay. That's a model, a good model to put forward to offer simple explanations. But I think because of that, we haven't really, for example, explored in great depth the effects that emotion has on a crime, for example, because we've never done that. So I agree with your point. I think maybe we're talking about two audiences, and but ways of making it simple and explainable, I think, are crucial. I agree. Maybe we'll get our next speaker, and then if there's time at the end, we can again ask questions across the board. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Why is it not? Oh, yeah, here we go. Yeah. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Faisal, and first of all, when I understand I have to talk after Richard, Shane, and Kate, I say, oh, wow, it's a lot of pressure. And the thing is, I should tell people that I'm not a professor, and I don't even got my PhD yet. I'm a PhD student at UCL Department of Geography, working with Shane and James Cheshire. So first and foremost, it's still a work in progress. So don't get disappointed at the end of the presentation if you haven't see a lot of results. To give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll give you a general background to the whole research idea. And I'll also spend some time discussing how we go about collecting the data for this research project, and then some mapping and modeling of crime incidents that we were able to do with the data we've collected, then what we will be doing in the future. So as a background, we have had from very brilliant discussion in the morning and also this afternoon. What I really get from those discussions and these presentations, it's that we know a lot. We know much about how crimes occur in particular places, but not in others. But you may all agree with me, or at least some of you will agree with me, that much of what we know is based on the experiences of Euro-American cities. We know very little about what is happening outside these areas. So, and of course, obviously for some obvious reasons which we can spend the whole day discussing. But part of this problem is the extremely sparse data on crime and population data sets in other regions, such as Nigeria, a typical developing country, which becomes a very challenging environment to conduct the research that we can take for granted in more developed countries. So this, my PhD project is not looking at all crime types, but rather we are concentrating on what we call residential property crime, which is basically burglary, stealing, damage to property, and crimes that has to do with automobile. So the first question we ask ourselves is, does data exist to conduct the kind of research that we want to conduct in a typical setting like Nigeria, which is the focus of the study? We know in developing countries you can collect, first of all, crime data through various sources or various means, such as the 111 call in the US or 999, is it the 911 call in the US or 101 call in the UK, and other means through like the online reporting system. But in the context we are talking about, a typical developing country, these sources don't actually exist. So how are crime reported in such countries? Oops. Reports, crime are normally reported directly to the police station. And how does the process work? First of all, it starts with a victim being victimized and going into a police station directly and reporting to officers like these ones. This is a typical, counter of a police station in Nigeria. And it opens 24/7. So anytime a crime occurs, if you want the authorities to know, you walk into that police station and report the crime. And all what is being reported to the police normally goes into this, what they call a police crime diary. And if we open this police crime diary, which is here, a very rough handwriting, so I try to transcribe it here, we can see a lot of information that will help us to understand what actually occurred. Most importantly, we have the type of crime that occurred, the date, and sometimes even the time that the crime occurred. And most importantly, from a geographical perspective, we know the exact location where that crime occurred. And if we can remove this information and put it in a table like this, we can have a lot of information to work with. But, other data sets that we may need to conduct this kind of research include the census data, which in the context of most of the developing countries that I'm talking about, there is no publication of census data at a very fine geographical scale. In fact, much of the places are not clearly defined. There is no defined boundaries of such smaller geographical units, such as output area or lower output area or lower super output area, which we have in the UK. There is no much documented information about the physical setting of the environment. And let's not forget, the entry into the police crime diary is not normally done this way, with the exact location of where the crime occurred. Much of what goes into it, it's kind of a descriptive address. For instance, if there is maybe a famous market or a shop, then they will use that as a reference to describe where that crime occurred. But the main problem with what is in the police crime diary is it's near impossible to get access to that data. It's impossible, or at least to me, it's impossible, because I tried for several months to get access to that police diary so that we can extract the data and help the police to understand what is happening, but we couldn't do that. So with this kind of challenge, is there any prospect of understanding what is really happening in those areas? This is what we attempt to do, to see if we can get hold of information and try to understand what is happening. But before I describe the method we use in collecting this data, let me just give you a bit of background to the study area. The study area is located in Kaduna Metropolis. It's a city of close to over 1 million, and it was the former capital of the northern region of Nigeria, which was established sometimes around 1914 by the then Governor General of Nigeria, Lord Lugard. And there are 11 different districts in the city. So for the purpose of this research, we chose one, which is called the Badra Malali district, which has a population of over 100,000. And but the main motivation that leads us to select this district as a case study, it's the kind of variation that exists between the neighborhoods within this boundary, so that we can have a representation of all different kind of settings in the city. And you can have an extreme situation like this, a decent one like this, and all living close to each other. So it will be interesting to know what is happening within these different neighborhoods. So the first thing we did was we have to map the whole area, and we did that by getting a high-resolution satellite imagery and demarcating the area into 88 different map sections. I don't know if you can see the numbers here. Each number represents a map section, and there is a boundary for each of the map section. And the aim is to identify each and every property within the study area so that we can map and record that property. So this is the example of one of the map sections that we use during the exercise. And if here, as you can see, that just to give you an idea of how we are able to map the properties, here is a property that we identify and give each and every property a unique reference code, which will help us to integrate any data sets that we will collect pertaining at this property. And after assigning the unique reference code and accounting for each and every property that is within the area, we undertook a block environmental inventory to collect various kind of information, a range of information about that particular property, which includes the land use within that property, whether the property is occupied or not, is it a vacant land or abandoned building, and so on. And then we also look at the building type and some access control elements of the property, which include, is the wall high, is there any barbed wire, is the entrance through gate, is there any outdoor seating, and so on. And again, we also thought of putting CCTV camera, even though we have the belief that we won't find any. The project took us over 4 weeks to conduct the field work, but the planning, getting to the field, coming back to the field and processing the data, it's taken us forever to finish. And almost 3 weeks of intensive field work, and we were able to identify over 13,000 properties and have the record of those property. And then we even, to try to motivate the enumerators, we created a real-time reporting which helps the enumerators in giving them direction and even creating a league table so that everybody will be motivated to work. And this is an example of the league table which we created. So everybody wants to be at the top of the league. The second stage of the data collection was a household and crime victimization survey. It was assisted self-completion questionnaire, which we did. The first section of the victimization survey asked information about the household, basically employment status, family size, household composition, and so on. And the second part of the victimization survey collected information about, asked information about measures of collective efficacy. And then the final part of the victimization survey asked respondents about their experience of being victims of a crime. And for every questionnaire that we administer for the household and crime victimization survey, we assign a unique reference code to it that corresponds what we've allocated during the mapping exercise. And the main target of the household, the survey, is the household heads. So, and out of the over 10,000 properties, which not all are residential, we were able to administer over 3,000 questionnaire, which represents a little bit above 25% of the total population. There are challenges. There are a lot of challenges. First of all, it's very difficult from the beginning to mark, the boundaries of a property in the areas, the slum-like areas, which we call the unplanned areas. And we have also recorded some cases of duplicating the property reference code, which makes it very difficult at the stage of analysis to integrate the data sets. So we have to discard some of the information, though it's very little. And from the beginning, we intended to go on a systematic sampling, whereby we take every third or fourth house on a street, but it wasn't possible, because we will get to a property and we discover that maybe the person that's supposed to respond, it's not around, or a respondent would even decide to not to answer the questions. So the first thing we did with the data, before I go, let me just show you what we were able to start doing with the data. The first thing, this is a map of, maybe a wrong choice of color, but these green dots represent where we have taken the samples. This is where we have taken the samples. And from the sample of 3,294, over 480 respondents reported being victims of burglary, which represents around 15% of the sample. And for stealing, it's almost double that number. And for the other crimes, it's relatively lower than burglary. So again, from the data, from the questionnaire, we ask how many times have you been a victim of a crime? So based on that, we were able to get the number of people or the number of households that experience repeat victimization, which is telling us how the rate of risk of an area or a property of being victim of the same type of crime within a period of 1 year, which if for almost all, for the first for three of the crimes that we looked at, we have a rate of victimization of over 60%. And for burglary, it's close to 50, which indicates that if we can understand why this crime is, occurring over and over again within that property, then we can try to suggest prevention measures. So this is another simple map just to show where burglary occur. I just take burglary as an example to show how we are able to map the data. And now from this map also we can see some kind of pattern emerging from the data, clustering of some re-victimization in this part of the study area and this part of the area. But in this area, which is the most affluent area, we could not find a single case of burglary. So to take it further, we look at some of the variables that we've collected and see how they can help us to predict why crime occurs in a particular area. Though at this stage the result would not be so definite, but at least we have an idea of the kind of variables that we should be looking at when modeling how we can predict crime in an area. These are the ones that are most significant, and we understand from this that burglary proof, which maybe I have to explain what burglary proof is. It's sometimes if you have been to, for some of us that have been to places like Africa, you would see people using like broken bottles, iron bars, and on top of their walls to prevent burglars from breaking into the house. So we understand that those properties with that burglary proof have a reduced risk of being victims of burglary. So if you have a burglary proof in the house, it reduces the risk. But what is surprising is if for those properties with external lighting, they have a higher risk of being burgled. I say it's surprising because a lot of times in Nigeria there isn't any electricity. So even in the night, power always goes off. So why are we getting this variable as predictor of higher risk of crime? Then which makes us to start thinking, oh, hold on, it can be a sign of affluence, because the affluent properties have a generator that they start and sleep overnight with it, which possibly perhaps they would light their houses and attract offenders to that particular property. But I don't want to speculate. This is the case we're just thinking. So what's next? We have to work more on the data. We're currently working on the data at street segment level because we have collected information about the streets, each and every property it's located. We're also thinking of using districting technique to create neighborhood boundaries and to see if we can understand any neighborhood effect. And of course, there will be more spatial and statistical analysis and modeling of the data. And what comes to our mind is multi-level or hierarchical modeling approach, looking at the structure of the data we got. As I mentioned earlier, it's still a work in progress. Before I go, I want to leave you with this, that let's drop the notion that it's impossible to conduct this kind of research in developing countries. But of course, availability of data remains a major challenge of researchers in these countries. But the simple methods that we think they are not worth looking at can provide us the most needed information. But of course, not that it's not complicated and without many challenges. So there is need for us to conduct more research on this kind of setting so that we can know what is happening there. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions, and any suggestion is welcome. Thank you very much.
So you mentioned proposal first. There's one at the back there, and then.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm very interested in your broader study, your PhD or whatever you say you're busy with. What exactly is it that you want to show? Do you ultimately with it? It's incredibly interesting that you're trying to find ways to get data in areas where data is so limited. But ultimately, are you trying to show or compare how crimes happen in specific situations, say between developing and developed countries? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Where should I go? Anyway, thanks for that question. First of all, the motivation of the study was started from the belief that most policies we have in developing countries that try to prevent the occurrence of crime, it's based on what we know in a different context, which might not work in those areas. So the first thing is to look at these theories, test these theories, and see if they can really predict or help us to explain pattern of crime in these countries. If they do, then fine. We can learn from a lot of things that happen in developed countries. But if at the end of it we understand that no, these theories cannot explain the patterns of crime in such contexts, then it's a call for us to start thinking on how we should deal with our problems or how to deal with those problems. Yeah.
There was one here too.
Okay.
I just want to say, first of all, this is baseline, very important baseline information, because we don't know this, and it's very hard to figure out how to do what you did. So I really hand it to you.
Thank you.
The thing that's going to be most interesting, something that I urge you to do, if you still have some people in the field, is to look at Danielle Reynald's work. She's in Griffith University, where she has gone to see whether someone sees me. In other words, if I go in front of your house, does anybody see me? Do they say anything? Do I see them? Do they see me? Do they say anything? Those are the key predictors of local crime. And one of the questions is, and this is something that could be done in your setting.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to find out whether it may be that in a developing country the floor effects are different. That is, by floor effects I mean what people will bother to steal will be different than in a developed country where people couldn't be bothered to steal $10.
Yeah.
They couldn't be bothered to steal potatoes. But the level of poverty may be such that the mix of what they'll do will be somewhat different.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. Thank you very much for
one more here.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for a lovely presentation. We've all enjoyed it, and we can only vouch the ethics that you
Thank you.
I would ask advise you to have a look at the International Crime Victimization surveys, because there is a whole series of paper on victimization in developing countries. And my recollection is that you get as phenomenal levels of complete victimisation, which one could only suppose would mean that there is no capacity to respond to an initial incident. So you don't have the money to improve your security. But even so, I mean, very, very interesting, because there was clearly some quite unique offenders going on. And the reason they chose it in the first place remains extraordinarily strong, and they're choosing to change it again. But there's a unique publication on the ICBS in developing countries, and I'm not sure whether you have come across it, but if you haven't, you should certainly know. Thank you very much for a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the
A very quick one from Gloria then.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to mention that in response to what she said, because it's a kind of situation whereby the state doesn't do much in protecting people. So you are being protected if you have enough to hire maybe private guards, have a barbed wire all through your house, and employing a lot of things to add more protection to your property. So I can, absolutely agree that much of even though we haven't gone deep into the data and see the demography of the people that have been re-victimized, but I expect to see a lot of that happening within, the poor or less affluent areas in contrast to what will be happening in the affluent areas. But thank you very much for your help.
Unless there's a burning question for any of the panelists, we might call that an evening, do you think? Okay, so thanks very much.
Great job.